Over the last 10 years, Peter and I have been trawling through the IPA data bank, trying to find some sort of general principles about what makes marketing communication effective, what makes it work, what sells stuff. So I thought I'm going to just start by summarising the whole of our last 10 years' work in one slide. No pressure. We've discovered a lot of interesting patterns in the data, but I'd like to just focus on a small number of them. The first thing is that the engine of growth is penetration, not loyalty. And in this, we're absolutely aligned with the people at Ehrenberg Bass, the findings first of Andrew Ehrenberg, going all the way back to the 1960s, right up to Byron Sharp now. Loyalty marketing underperforms. Brand loyalty is not the primary engine of growth and profit, it's penetration. There is a role for loyalty, but it's a secondary role, a supporting role. And the way that you grow the way that you grow penetration, the way you grow brands, is primarily through reach, through talking to everybody who buys the category, rather than tight targeting. So this goes against much of the sort of rhetoric of how we used to think marketing worked, when we talked about targeting and loyalty. It's about penetration and reach. And because it's about reach, because it's about talking to everyone who buys the category, talking to them more than your competitors do, share of voice is a really important metric. Budget still matters. The only reliable way to get reach in today's digital world is you still have to pay for it. There is no free lunch. So media budgets still matter. Share of voice still matters. And we see no change in the relationship between market share and share of voice over the last 30 or even 40 years, which is remarkable given all the changes in the media landscape. But while budget matters and share of voice matters, how you spend that budget matters as well. How you allocate the budget between brand building and activation is really important. And in the long and the short of it, we talked about the 60-40 rule. It seems that the most effective campaigns tend to spend about 60% of their comms budget on brand building and about 40% on activation. And that's something we're going to talk about quite a bit today. Brand building primarily works at a sort of system one level, at an emotional level. It's about emotions, feelings, associations, rather than messages. Glad to see Paul's here, Paul Feldwick. I mean, your work on emotional advertising as opposed to rational advertising was a big inspiration to us in the early days of our research. Brand building is what drives long-term business growth, long-term growth in sales, the base level of sales, long-term growth in market share, and also it reduces price sensitivity, so it helps you to increase margins. So it's the big driver of long-term profit gains. Activation, what we call sales activation, much more direct selling stuff, works at the system 2 level, works with the more conscious, rational brain. It's very good, very efficient at getting short-term sales. And because it increases the efficiency rather than the effectiveness of your marketing, it tends to lead to high ROI. So just 5 of the key findings from our previous research. What we're going to do today is look at how those rules may or may not vary by marketing context. Because the question we've been asked many times over the years was, these rules are, for example, great for an FMCG brand, but how does it work for a bank or for a telecoms company or for Amazon or any of these things? So what we're trying to do here is to examine how the rules do or don't vary by marketing context. So I'm going to start talking about emotional and rational categories. While human decisions are primarily emotional, I think this is one of the things that's coming out of contemporary psychology, is that most of our decision making takes place at the system 1 level. The balance between emotional and rational does vary by context, depending on, what the kind of decision it is. So how does that affect the way communication works? Well, But what we see is that any kind of involvement in the decision-making, interest, if you like, increases the effectiveness of communications. So here we have data on the role of rational consideration. How important is rational thinking to the decision-making process? And what we find is that the more people think about the purchase decision, the more effective marketing communications tend to be. And this is, if you like, emotional involvement. The more people feel deeply involved in the purchase decision, the more effective marketing communications tend to be. So either rational involvement or emotional involvement both tend to increase the effectiveness of communications. In other words, the more you care about the purchase, the more effective advertising and marketing communications tend to be. But the two rational and emotional components have slightly different effects. First of all, what we find is, regardless of whether it's an emotional or a rational decision, penetration is still the name of the game. It's always primarily about gaining new customers, not about increasing brand loyalty. Brand loyalty is secondary. But what we do find is that in more rational categories, categories where thinking dominates, then we get bigger activation effects. In more emotional categories, we tend to get bigger brand effects. And that's exactly what we would have expected to find, given our previous work on the emotional nature of brand building. We also see that there's a slight difference in the mix of volume and price effects. In more rational categories, the way you tend to make money is by just selling more stuff. In more emotional categories, a larger part of the payback comes through price and margins. And again, that makes good sense. Effectively, paying more for the same product is a less rational thing. You can only do that by getting people to emotionally engage with the brand, and that fits with what we found before. And what we see is we get the biggest effects when you can get both emotional and rational working together. And again, that fits with what we've seen before about the nature of getting brand building and activation working together. So what does that mean for budgets? Well, what we find is this is a measure of budget efficiency. This is our ESOB efficiency metric. And what we find is that the more emotional the decision, the more the advertising media tend to be efficient. Where you've got a highly rational decision, you tend to get more of your growth from non-advertising factors, which could either be new product development, pricing, offers, or activation. And again, that makes sense. If people are making the decision on a very emotional level, then they may be more influenced by cartoon cats. If they're being more rational about it, they may be using price comparison sites. What we found slightly surprising is, for the 60-40 rule, actually, best practice is to slightly upweight brand media in more rational categories and slightly downweight brand building in more emotional categories. And I think basically that's because advertising works harder when the decision is emotional, you don't have to do quite so much of it. In more rational categories, you have to bump up the ad spend to get through to people. So there is a slight variation from the 60-40 rule there. Okay, so another big issue and a related issue is product innovation. Big issue, obviously, in the last 20 years when we've seen tremendous technical progress, a lot of new products, new categories coming through. How does that affect things? Well, when you've got product innovation, you get a very definite increase in the effectiveness of marketing communications. Advertising and marketing works better when you've got new news about new products. And the more radical the innovation, the bigger the effect. The biggest effects of all are when you're launching a completely new category, slightly smaller effect for launching a new brand, taking an existing brand into a new category, slightly smaller effect, launching a new sub-brand, for example, like a premium variant, slightly smaller effect. The smallest effect of all is launching a new variant within an existing brand. You know, the classic, launching a mint flavour something or other, or now with jelly or something like that. And in fact, actually, new variant launches are quite significantly underperform. They're actually worse than doing no product innovation at all. Now, and of course, this is the most popular form of innovation that there is. Footling minor innovation done mainly, I think, to have something to say, and that is an ineffective strategy, particularly common in mature markets. Again, what we find is, regardless of what kind of innovation you're doing, penetration is the main driver, not loyalty. And it tends to be, the effects tend to be more activation effects, more short-term volume. So innovation actually very often is a slightly more short-term strategy. You get a little bit of a boost, particularly down here, a little bit of a boost from launching a new product, but maybe not quite so durable. And it tends to come through volume, not price, and that's not surprising either, because very often new products are launched at a discount with offers, and often at that stage it's not sufficiently mature to allow you to do premium pricing. What we find is, when you've got product innovation, advertising media work harder, so that's great. It makes your advertising more effective and more efficient. Also, it boosts growth from other factors. So probably activation works harder from what we're seeing. Also, just straightforward, getting the stuff on the shelves gives you a boost. What should you do in terms of 60-40? Well, overall, if you've got product innovation, you probably need to slightly upweight the brand spend, make people aware of the new product. But the one area where we couldn't give you an important area where we couldn't give you a clear answer is for when you're launching a brand. And this is an odd one. We couldn't find an optimum brand activation ratio. What we see is that the sample is split between some new brands are launched with massive amounts of brand building, big awareness campaigns, and some are launched successfully with primarily at activation level. Now, I think we're going to do some more research there, but I suspect part of this may relate to what's happening online, that we now have increasing numbers of brands being launched without big advertising campaigns, launched online using, for example, if you think of, like lots of the big digital players, like, say, Uber, for example. Uber grew very successfully in the early phases without having to use advertising as part of the mix. I mean, it's interesting they're shifting towards advertising now. But they were using more digital member promotions rather than advertising. So I think this is an interesting one, that this is one area where we can't see a clear optimum, and that may explain some of the trends we're seeing in the data over the last 20 years. Now, related to that, category development. We've divided categories up into new categories, categories that are growing, mature categories, and declining categories. And what you can see is, as the category matures, the effects of advertising overall get smaller. The biggest effects tend to be when the category is young. So this is our overall measure of effectiveness across all the different business metrics. What we find is, regardless of the development of the category, penetration is still the name of the game. Penetration effects are the main engine of growth, with loyalty second. But what we do see is that loyalty effects become relatively more important as the category matures. So in the early days, it's all about getting new customers, and gradually, as the category matures, the importance of extracting more value from existing customers increases. We also see a shift from pure volume effects to price effects as the category matures. In the early days, it's about gaining customers, getting market share, pretty much at any price to get first mover advantage. As the category matures, then you can begin to move towards getting higher prices, higher margins, and more value from those customers. And correspondingly, what we see is a shift from top-line profit or bottom-line profit growth, the headline profit figure, towards ROI as the category matures. And again, I think that relates to the price effect. What we see is higher ROIs when you can get premium prices. So basically, every contact with the customer becomes more valuable. Advertising efficiency declines as the category matures. So actually, it becomes harder and harder to gain market share as time goes on. And we find that the brand activation optimum seems to shift slightly from brand towards activation as the category matures. So as time goes on, it becomes less about recruiting more customers and gaining market share and so forth with advertising, and more about extracting value from those customers, perhaps through things like CRM. And that naturally brings us into the development of individual brands, and we see a very similar thing. So we've got new brands here, niche brands, which is a fairly small group here, small brands that aren't niche brands here, strong challengers and market leaders. And what we see is that as the brands get bigger and stronger, the effects of advertising get smaller. When you're a brand leader, you just have less market share to gain, less headroom to grow. The biggest effects tend to be when the brand is first launched. Niche brands do well. So if you can find an area of the market that you can dominate, then that's a great place to be. Although, as Byron Sharp points out, niche brands are very rare. Most of what people call niche brands are actually just small brands. And small brands are, as you'll see in a minute, in a rather difficult position. Again, regardless of brand development, it's primarily penetration that drives growth, but we do see loyalty become relatively more important as the brand grows and matures. And again, we see this shift from volume to price as the brand matures. There are 2 points in a brand's life where activation effects tend to be particularly strong. When the brand is first launched, this is when sending out offers, getting trial for the new product can be a very useful strategy. And leader brands can also use activation very profitably, and I suspect that's a different kind of activation, much more about exploiting your customer base through CRM to cross-sell or to send offers to the people who you've got a relationship with. So there's 2 quite different ways in which you can exploit activation. Looking at share of voice efficiency again, what we find is that campaigns for new brands are much, much more efficient than anything else. They're you get really strong effects at brand launch, which is one of the reasons why brand owners tend to spend a lot of money on advertising when they first launch a brand. It's the classic gaining awareness. But immediately after launch, efficiency drops quite dramatically. Once you've no longer got new news, if you haven't actually gained a foothold in the market, you're just a small, underperforming and often failing brand. And that's quite a difficult trap to be in. And what we also find is, as you move towards brand leadership, the effects of advertising grow again. Very strong big brands have all sorts of economies of scale which allow them to exploit advertising more efficiently. Wider distribution, perhaps more competitive prices, and so forth. So there are 2 points in the market where advertising works really well: when you're new and when you're big. And actually that's true for activation and other factors as well. When you're new, you've got strong people are interested in you. You can immediately get trial through offers. It's a great place to be, and the same is true for being big. Being caught in between is not good. What we see is that there are some indications that the 60-40 rule is slightly different depending on where you are. As I say, we can't give you an optimum for new brands, but what we can say is that for small brands, actually, it's much more in favour of activation than brand. Whereas strong challenger brands that are on the way up, it's much more brand focus. And I think what's coming out of this is a lot of these small mainstream brands are really only able to compete on price because they don't have the advantage of novelty. They don't have the advantage of exploiting a profitable niche. They're stuck in the mainstream, and presumably they've either been rejected in terms of distribution or quality or something like that. So the only way they can really compete is on price. And that takes us through to price. What we see is that the effects of price the effects of advertising do vary by price position. And there are 2 points in the market where you get the biggest effect. At the bottom end of the market, if you've got really low prices, advertising and marketing communications work well. And at the very top end of the market, if you've got super premium prices, advertising and marketing communications tend to work really well. It's the mainstream where the effects are smaller. Basically, if you've got something to say, then advertising works better. You can either say, we've got low prices, or you can say we've got high quality, and that tends to be make advertising work harder. Again, penetration is always the name of the game, not loyalty, and I'm going to keep saying that. But we do see that the mix of effects changes as you go up in price, so that loyalty effects become relatively more important for premium products. The shift of effects is quite obviously volume at the bottom end, price at the top, profit growth at the bottom end, and ROI at the top, because you will always get high ROI if you've got high prices, high margins, high value customers. And as I say, you get strong activation effects at both ends of the market. Here is the world of sending people offers, money off, etc. Here is much more the realm of activation used for CRM to extract value from your customer base. Now, unfortunately, the data, the sample sizes don't allow us to interrogate advertising efficiency for all 4 parts of the market, so we can only look at the top half of the market versus the bottom. But what we see is that advertising works harder at the bottom half of the market, which is not surprising. You're talking about mass products and you've got a price advantage. At the top half of the market, other factors such as product quality and CRM tend to work slightly better. But I suspect if you could break it down even further, we would probably find that super premium is different from premium. And the 60-40 rule suggests upweight the activation for cheap brands, which is what people tend to do. So you don't have to do quite so much brand advertising. You just tell people we've got cheap products and send them offers. For more expensive brands, you need to spend more money on brand advertising. So Peter's now going to talk about some of the more up-to-date and interesting digital.
Okay, so I'm going to split the data in 3 different ways that we've never done before, which I think relate to kind of areas of interest that we've picked up. So we're going to look at, first of all, high research versus low research, specifically looking at online research. We're going to look at online brands versus offline brands. I'll talk about how I define those in a minute. And we're going to talk about subscription categories versus series purchase categories. So obviously services very much subscription, packaged goods very much series. And then finally, I'm going to come back and talk about how the rules vary, perhaps to a degree, by different sectors. But I'll talk a bit more about that when I come to it. So for those of you who are expecting detail on that, be warned, we're not going to give you huge amounts of detail yet. So let's start with, how does online research influence the rules of effectiveness? And the source we're using here is some TNS consumer research done for Google, which looks at the level of research done in different categories, and specifically here we're looking at the level of research done online. So thanks to Google for this. It doesn't cover all of the 500 and something case studies that we're looking at here in the post-98 era, but it covers most of them. But we can't categorize them all. So we're going to look specifically at high versus low research categories, those where a lot of research is done versus those where very little research is done online. And we're going to ignore the mush in the middle because it just makes life even more complex to think about. So not surprisingly here, what you find is that short-term effects are much stronger in high research categories. And I think that is kind of inevitable to a degree because we have many more opportunities to activate, and also we have more interested people, so we can activate more powerfully around that. So we tend to get much more powerful effects that tend to be associated with the early stages of growth, whether it's new customers or sales as opposed to market share, which tend to be skewed towards short-term sales, and of course activation effects. We don't tend to get the same level of uplift for what are more unambiguously long-term effects. So if we look at price sensitivity, loyalty, profit, market share, all of these are very unambiguously long-term metrics. We don't tend to see the same kind of thing. So I don't think there's any surprise in here, but high research is good for short-term effects. We also see that there is much higher efficiency, much higher responsiveness to advertising investment in high research categories. Now, that is really down more, I think, to something Les has already talked about, which is that these are often high interest categories. But I mean, clearly, to some extent, the research gives us added opportunities to drive the effectiveness of our investment behind the brand through greater levels of activation and perhaps more sophisticated activation. We have more opportunities. They're doing a lot of research. We're going to get a lot of data hits that enable us to activate. So again, lots of factors in there, and when we write the report, we're going to try and dig out some deeper explanations, but I'm certainly not going to try and explain these differences in detail here and now, because we would be here all day. But I think what's interesting here is just to come back to some of the data that Les was using earlier on, which is the extent to which decision-making in categories is seen to be emotionally driven or rationally driven or a bit of both. And you can see how we can't time trend online research, but we can time trend what I suspect is its legacy. So we see a marked shift away from primarily emotional, essentially to this sort of 50-50, even. We are led partly emotionally, but we also do a lot of research, and so we use information as well. There is quite a significant shift in that direction, not so much towards primarily rational, but more towards this group. That, of course, is pro-effectiveness, as Les has pointed out, so we should be a good trend for effectiveness. But we'll come back and talk about that later. But there is a huge danger in this. I mean, classically, what people would conclude from this is that, therefore, communications should be getting more rational, and we should be stepping back from our focus on emotional communications. In fact, the data doesn't support that at all. In fact, it contradicts it, because what we find is that even in high research categories, compared to low research categories, emotional campaigns are, if anything, slightly more efficient. They're certainly not less efficient or effective in these categories than in those. That may come as a surprise to many of you, but it's a pretty clear conclusion from this. So we are not saying here, and the data does not say, that this shift towards more information and more research is necessarily changing the kinds of advertising messages we should be putting out there. Because we still have to do the emotional priming piece to ensure that we influence the online research phase as we want, and that we drive online research in our direction. So no sense is that kind of weakening in any sense our focus on emotional campaigns. But what we do find, of course, is that marketers increasingly are feeling that the world is getting more rational. So we are seeing a difference between the incidence of primarily emotional campaigns in these high research categories. It's not a huge difference. I don't want to seem alarmist or start panicking just yet, but I'm just kind of floating a slight warning out there, because this difference is not borne out by the data. This is not suggested by the data. What we do also see is quite a marked difference in the commitment to brand building amongst these two groups. So this group put about 8% points more of their budget into activation than these guys do. Now, in the next chart, we're going to look at the wisdom of that, because, again, there are some surprises here. So in low research categories turn out to be pretty much a 60-40 rule, no significant real difference, departure from that. But in high research categories, actually the opposite of what you might expect is true. And we can only really explain this by saying that activation is so much easier to achieve in these high research categories. We can probably do it at lower cost. We can certainly do it more efficiently and much more easily. So it turns out that the emotional priming, the brand building role is very significantly more important in high research categories. Seems counterintuitive, but there is actually a logic to it. So big upweight in those categories. Let's talk briefly about online versus offline brands. Now, let me just explain what I mean. We don't have a huge number of case studies here which are pure online only, so we can't look at those separately. So when I talk about online brands, I mean brands where there is a very significant e-commerce component to their sales, where we can all very easily buy this brand online if we want. But many of these we can usually buy offline as well. We're going to compare those brands with brands that we can only buy offline and see whether and how differences play out. And again, you're probably not going to get the answer you expect here. So the obvious thing to say, Les and I bang on about the dangers of short-termism and how digital metrics are conditioning us to think more and more short-term. And here is some pretty strong evidence that is indeed at work in the marketplace. So online brands are massively, about twice as likely to be short-term, to be focused on driving short-term effects in short-term windows than offline brands. I will not bang on about the wisdom or lack of it of doing that, but we'll come back and suggest that actually the rules are not different. I mean, you'll be asking yourself, well, if I'm an online brand, is it right to be short-term? I'm going to answer that in a minute. Online brands are much more focused, of course, therefore, on short-term sales. So if we look at a long-term metric here, we find that offline brands tend to achieve much bigger long-term shifts, market share shifts, than online brands, whereas precisely the reverse is true if we look at the activation metric, which measures short-term responses. So you can see here how being online, and many of these brands have very significant offline presences. They're not all Ubers and Googles. These are very significant on and offline presences, but they are becoming sucked into the world of short-term thinking, principally because I suspect of their exposure to digital metrics. So is this smart? The answer is no. The interesting thing about this is there is no real difference. I mean, there is no significant difference between 60 and 57. These are both 60-40 sweet spots. That is where effectiveness maxes out for both these kinds of brands. So there is no evidence in this data that says just because we're online, we should suddenly start putting all our money into short-term activation. Not borne out by the data. Okay, let's look now at subscription versus series purchases. And so let me just define what I mean. So subscription purchases are where we have some kind of contract that binds us in for a period of time. Classically, they will be a utility or a telco, usually a service sector. Whereas series purchases are, toothpaste, packaged goods, classically. You know what I'm talking about. Let's see how that plays out. Well, first of all, and I think the interesting thing is to focus on subscription brands. So that's really what I'm going to do. Subscription brands are inevitably heavily focused on customer acquisition. And I think clearly in the marketplace that kind of conclusion has been reached, and I'm not going to challenge that. I think there's reasons we'll see in a moment that is very, very sensible. So we see massive uplifts. There's massive amount of more effort goes into driving customer acquisition here, and that is the primary phase. That's the single metric that distinguishes subscription brands from series brands. And we'll come back and look at the wisdom of that in a moment. Note that loyalty effects are much, much lower. So any of you out there who think, well, in subscription categories, loyalty must surely be a much bigger effect. Well, it's much lower, but I'm going to come back and answer that question specifically. But the market seems to have decided that if you're in the subscription sector, you should go for customer acquisition. But the focus on it is very, very strong. And we just ask one question, which is, are these brands, subscription brands, ignoring other drivers of growth? Les has talked about how price elasticity is in many sectors, in many categories, and at least as important a driver of growth and profit growth. But what we notice in these subscription categories is there's not much interest in that. Now, to be fair, it is partly because of there's a lot of financial services brands in this subscription category for whom the notion of price elasticity is a slightly difficult one to get your heads around. It is important, actually, I think, in financial services. It does have a meaning in financial services, but it's very rarely kind of examined and looked at. But anyway, all the focus is on customer acquisition. Is that a sensible thing to do? Well, let's just look at how let's just revisit the whole loyalty penetration story once more. Les has already talked about this. So this is very much what Les has talked about. If we pursue a loyalty strategy in series purchasing, we are kissing goodbye to the chances of top-line major success. I think we're all now firmly established that in classic series purchasing categories, this is dumb. So hopefully we can nail that. Acquisition is a better strategy, but saying to hang with all of that targeting, let's just go for everyone in the category, the reach strategy is the most important growth in series purchases. How does it differ in subscription? We've never been able to look at this before. We've never done this before. Byron Sharp has done a lot of work on this and said, look, the rules of growth still apply in subscription categories. I'm very happy to be able to say that essentially we entirely agree with him, with a slight refinement here. So look at the chances of success success with loyalty strategies in subscription categories. Again, it's a no-brainer. Do not waste your time and money. Do not be seduced by it. But I sense the market has moved away from that anyway, so I don't think it's a huge one. But the real smart money is indeed in driving customer acquisition, because once we've acquired customers, we obviously have much greater lifetime value from them, guaranteed lifetime value, at least to some degree. So there is huge sense in really focusing on acquisition, and much less benefit, if you like, from this much more broader approach to targeting, which says we're also going to talk to our existing customers, because we obviously have an ongoing, perhaps even day-to-day relationship with them, which is going to be much more influential on their future purchasing. So acquisition strategies make huge sense in subscription categories, but fundamentally this doesn't in any way alter the laws of growth that the Ehrenberg Bass Institute have said to you, which is that it is all about reaching out to new customers, worrying about non-customers and the long tail of very likely. That is absolutely true, and that is what this bears out, which of course is a huge relief, because no one wants to pick a fight with Byron Sharp. You don't want to do it. We're cowards, Les and I. But now here is the thing, here is the interesting thing. The inevitable conclusion of that, so serious purchasing, pretty much a 60-40 rule, no great departure from that, as you would expect. But in subscription categories, because of the vital importance of bringing new customers in, of course, it requires us to reach out to new customers who don't know us, don't care about us, have no interest in us. We have to do the emotional priming bit. We have to do the brand building bit. It becomes extra important, super important for subscription categories. And as we'll see, the pattern of effect is more subtle than that. We'll come back to that. But in principle, in subscription categories, we need to be upping our brand investment, our brand share of spend quite significantly. Right, let's move on now to individual categories. And now I've got to manage expectations here. Some of you are going to be disappointed in the level of depth that we're going to go into here. Because Les and I have fielded a number of questions in recent years from people who are interested in individual categories. And the typical question we field is along the lines of this. Can you tell us the ideal brand activation balance in premium packaged Trappist lagers? Now, I'd love to be able to tell you what the ideal brand activation balance was in those kinds of, but we're never going to be able to do it with this database. We're never going to be able to get to that level of refinement. So we're here looking at sectors, and I can't even report on all the sectors for reasons I will come to in a moment. I would like to be able to report on all of these sectors. These are the responsiveness to advertising. So we see there are some very, very big differences. We've reported this before. This is an update. So retail is very relatively unresponsive to a share of voice, whereas service sectors in general are very highly responsive. Durables come somewhere in the middle, and packaged goods very much down with retail. So there are some very big differences. Now, I would like to be able to give you a 60-40 sweet spot for all 5 of these. I can only do it for 3. And I think the reasons are we can't do it in packaged goods because there is clearly too much heterogeneity within that sector. We are essentially comparing, butter with shampoo. And there are clearly too many different other kinds of factors that come into play in different subsectors. We've tried cutting it by food and drink versus non-food and drink, and even that hasn't produced a clean response that enables us to report any findings. We're going to keep on looking at this because this is very important. We have to find new ways to cut these very big, broad category definitions in ways that enable us to make sense. There's clearly something we have missed in the data at the moment. I don't want to plead for sympathy, but it is actually quite tough trying to find the patterns in this data. Can't do it for packaged goods. Also, we can't do it for durables, probably for the same reason. We're grouping cars with jewellery and a whole bunch of other stuff in there with very, very different kinds of motivations and distribution mechanisms, all of the other stuff that's in there. We can do it for retail, financial services, and services, other kinds of services than financial. So that's what I'm going to do. And that's as much as you're going to get for the time being, I'm afraid. We will come back with more refinements later on. So let's look at financial services. And again, I think there's lots of reasons why. There is a very, very significant need to upgrade, to upweight our investment in brand building when it comes to financial services. Now, Les and I looked at this a few years ago. It was already well above 60-40 then, and we reported that to a private client at the time. It seems to have moved even further with more recent data. So we're now looking at something like a 75-25 kind of split between brand building and activation. Now, the reasons why that might be the case are no doubt many and varied. It might be to do with the number of brands in the category, the complexity of these categories, or indeed the slightly bombed out nature of many of the brands in this category post the financial meltdown. There are many, many reasons why this might be the case, but that is quite an extreme shift from our 60-40 rule. So, I think many people have said to us in recent years, surely this 60-40 rule is just an average, and we've always acknowledged that is the case. We've never really been able to put numbers to variations, but you are going to see some quite significant variations from this. So those of you who have been telling us that there were significant variations will be able to say, we told you so. You're absolutely right. We finally caught up with you. This is the one where I think many of you may say that. So let's look at other kinds of services. Now, I should just say, in the IPA database, this is dominated by quick service restaurants, so a lot of brands in there for that, travel brands and media brands. Now, these all have very perishable commodities. Burgers are expensive things to throw away. Empty plane seats are expensive things to have. And indeed, unwatched TV shows or magazines are expensive things to have to deal with. So there is very good reason why many of the brands in this sector should be very, very focused on short-term effects, which is what you're about to see. But also, there's a big bunch of telcos and utilities in here who, again, I guess the implication of underused infrastructure and resource is very important. So I think there are some common strands in these, but that is what dominates in the IPA data this particular sector. And we haven't yet done the comparison with industry data to know whether it's a skew, but that is the reality. So this is what we find. Very, very different picture. So it's pretty much a 65-35 split, to put it in kind of rounded terms, between activation and brand building. The very opposite. I'm sure there'll be many people out there who say, told you so, and you are right. So it is very, very much more important. It's very important to upweight activation in these kind of cases. We've got to keep the footfall in the quick service restaurants. We've got to keep bums on seats in general. Retail, kind of halfway between the two. I suppose it does share to some extent that kind of perishability, but also in retail, we know we've got to keep the footfall coming. We've got to keep people coming through the door. We're not going to sell them anything. So I think, again, retailers are quite right to spend more on activation than the 60-40 rules. And I should say, on average, over the last 10 or 20 years or so, most of these categories have been pretty close to the 60-40 rule. I'll come back to that in a moment. So these are all, in many instances, quite departures from what has often been done. But it's about a 50-50 rule in retail. So these are quite significant departures, and we expect to find more of these when we look at the category-specific level. So be warned. Now, just in case any of you were sitting there thinking, yeah, this is all terribly theoretical and kind of academic, does it really matter in the real world of commerce and business and so on? So I just want to try and prove to you that I think it really does, and I think the evidence is there in this database to show that it really does matter whether we pursue these variations in the 60-40 rule or not. Les and I have already shown and suggested to you that the decline in the typical and average level of effectiveness across all categories is in some way related to our abandonment of the 60-40 rule in this country and the fact that we are increasingly spending way more than 40% of our budgets on activation. But the question is, does that vary by category depending on what is going on in a category, on a category-by-category level? And that's where I want to kind of nail this, if we can. So if you look at retail, this is how retail's share of budget over time has varied. This is indexed, so this is, obviously couldn't be more than 100 if it was a share of budget. I've just indexed it so we can compare all of these and it all looks clean and simple. So retail for a time spent more, upped its weight of spend on brand building and then fell back pretty much to its long-term average. So it's kind of come back to where it was. Very different pattern in financial services, which has been relentlessly and very strongly cutting its investment in brand building. There's been a huge shift in the financial services sector towards an activation approach, possibly in part driven by the pressure from aggregators, but whatever there is, we'll look at the wisdom of that in a moment. But you already know that that is counter-effectiveness. I've already told you that in financial services we need to be upweighting brand, so this is downweight. So we might expect to see some negative effects from that. Whereas services non-financial have done very much the same. These other kinds of brands have done very much the same. But you now know that that is actually probably pro-effectiveness. These are all starting from around about a sort of 60-40 balance. So that trend might be good, that trend might be bad, and that trend might be kind of a bit of both, not very much of a team. So let's see how it plays out. does indeed. This is one of the few sectors in the IPA database where we're actually seeing positive news, where we're seeing a growth in the typical effectiveness of the brands there. So I would suggest to you that is consistent with the fact that they are moving, have been moving over time towards an optimum balance in the way they spend their money. If we look at retail, we see it's kind of muddled along on a level. No great change there. Consistent with the way they've played with their budget over the years. And if we look at financial services, it is, probably the most damaged sector in the sense of average effectiveness. It has very much led the downward trend. And again, that is exactly what you would expect when you look at the sweet spots for effectiveness and you compare them with the trends that we've just seen. So it seems to marry up with that. So I would suggest to you that it all makes sense. Now, I'm not going to take you through this. This is our Ready Reckoner. You will have this. This is a summary of all of the sweet spots that we've identified. There will be more to come. This is a very, very, very incomplete list, for which my huge apologies. We will get there in the end one day, or die in the trying. But so there will be a longer list coming out of all of this. So anyway, let's move. So you'll get the chance. You don't have to take photos of it. I mean, take photos of Les and I. We love it. So quick conclusions. As we've seen, I mean, we've known this for years. Of course, Millwall Brown have been saying this for many years, that Marcoms work much harder when consumers are interested in the category or there is new brand news. The question is, this means that innovation usually justifies greater brand investment, but there's no clear optimum for launches. And I think, as Les has intimated, what we're finding with launches is quite complex. It depends on the time scale over which we are measuring success. If we're looking at very short-term success, then probably we should be upping activation. But if we're really looking at getting through that pinch point that Les has identified of when we're no longer new, but actually we're suddenly just a small brand in a competitive category, then we definitely need to be upweighting brand. So there is clearly some kind of subtle transition phase where we go from very early heavy activation very rapidly through to making sure we have a point of view as a brand in the category. But we need to do more work on that. I'm sure there is some fiendishly complex analysis that we might be able to do to really prove that. It's a hypothesis at the moment. So we should not assume that because a category is highly rational, or there is a lot of research done it, that means that we should all be doing very rational advertising, or that we should be upping our activation spend. You've seen that actually that is not true. We stick with the emotional plan and follow the rules of brand activation that are dictated really by the category. Penetration growth is always a better strategy than loyalty. We have all of the cuts of the data that you have seen, whether from Les or me. That is true in. There is never a situation that we have yet found where loyalty strategies make sense. And I'm not just saying that because I don't want to be beaten up by Byron Sharp. I promise you it is true. Subscription categories benefit from much greater brand investment. That's a kind of bit of a no-brainer, obvious if you think about it. Online brands have a very similar balance to offline. That's perhaps a bit of a surprise to many of you. But as we've said to you, there are actually quite wide variations in the optimum balance between the sectors on the category level. So thank you very much for listening to us. That's
Okay, in the yellow shirt.
Hi, David Shield, House of Kaizen. I'm really interested in the subscription findings, particularly your assessment of loyalty perhaps not having the same impact as activation. The data that you're showing seems to primarily come from the larger utility brands, telcos. How would you believe that would skew with smaller subscription brands? So online subscription brands like Grays.com, or even media like Times or Wall Street Journal, given that at some point they hit a level of maximisation. At that point, maintaining that level of subscription requires some form of engagement, loyalty, retention strategy. I just wonder how that perhaps might skew in these findings if you were able to break it down to.
It's a good question. I mean, we haven't, and I'm not sure we would be able to really answer that question. I mean, there is a spectrum. There are a lot of subscription brands in this database. Whether we have enough that we could categorise as small, but we will look at that. It's an interesting challenge. But we've looked at this in other contexts for other purposes. And essentially, I don't think you'll get a different answer for small brands. I don't think just because you're a small brand that loyalty becomes a smart... It might be a survival strategy, but I don't think it's a growth strategy. I really don't. Les, would you?
think I can be more definite than that. First of all, we don't see any examples of any marketing context where loyalty strategies work whatsoever. And if you look at the Ehrenberg-Bass stuff, they've reached the same conclusion with different data from different markets. Secondly, almost by definition, we know that small brands benefit more from penetration than big brands. So small subscription brands are going to be even more biased towards activation. There's no sense in which a company like Gray's, for example, has maxed out its customer base. It's tiny. You know, those brands need to get more customers. That's how they grow.
Yeah, I mean, often we get the question that says, look, we're too small, we can't afford to do this brand building bit. And I just, again, don't buy that. There are so many tools out there, so many new media opportunities, whether they're digital or non-digital media, where you really can do impressive brand building activities if you have the creative firepower. It becomes much more of a creative task if you're trying to do it on a low budget. You really need some serious creativity behind you, but it can be done. There are tons of case studies around the world of people who have done effective brand building with very small budgets, and it usually involves the meeting of creative use of media and the creative use of creativity, but it can be done. So I don't buy it. I think it's an excuse to say we can't afford to do it because we're too small.
Yeah, brand building is not necessarily saying TV or something like that, but the point is trying to achieve the right things. You don't grow by stronger engagement with your customers. Primarily you grow by getting more customers.
Next question. One behind with the glasses, and then front row here.
Hi, Pete and Les. Sorry for being late, as usual. You'll be used to that. Seamus here. Really interested in your point about an increase in decision-making on the rational level. And my question is that perhaps because it's more behaviourally measurable, i.e. measuring searches? Because in days of yore, when there was the yellow pages and classified advertising in your local advertiser, free press, that was less behaviourally measurable. So the point is, do you actually think that rational decision-making has become more prevalent?
Has changed, but I think what has changed, I don't know, the measurability issue is possibly one thing, but also it is just easier for people to do
much easier. Yeah, I can't believe that it's just a measurability issue. It is so much easier to do research, thanks to our friends from Google, amongst others. That must be the key driver of it, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Specific question.
Oh, you're not allowed to speak without a microphone.
A microphone for a very specific question. What if you are a subscription-based non-financial service? So, for example, buying entertainment from Sky, because I'm looking at something like that and I'm thinking, okay, it's subscription, so the balance should be more towards brand, and then I'm looking at non-financial services and going, it should be the opposite.
Okay, so
I told you specific.
A curly one, as somebody once said. So look, I mean, we should both answer this. I mean, I would say if we have provided you with more specific definition of the category, then go with the more specific one. But when we talk about subscription, it's a very, very broad classification. And you already know when you look at the differences between financial and non-financial services, most of which are subscription brands, that there are very big differences within it. So, but again, we just come back to this issue of how tightly can we analyse the data, and at the end of the day, it's going to be a bit of a judgment call.
The way when we publish this, effectively what it will give you is some guidelines on how to adjust your budgets up and down depending on context. So you go, okay, well, we're a subscription product, so adjust up in this direction. We're non-financial services, just in that direction, etc. We need an app. Yeah. But so one will be able to get some sort of guidelines on how to tweak the rules. But then the other thing I would say is that these rules are only a starting point. And what you should do is study your category and learn how things work in your category. So, for example, I've worked on utilities, and one of the first things we did was to look at the brand activation split and the share of voice, share of market relationship for energy companies. And it's different. It's not the same as the rest of the market. So learn what your competitors are doing, learn what works in your market. But what this does, it gives you a starting point if you've got no information at all, and it also helps you to understand what questions to ask.
Thank you, Les and Peter. I've got an idea. Because this is work in progress and the guys have another couple of months to finesse this work before it becomes a publication, it would be great for those people who haven't asked a question if you could send us your questions, because it will actually inform the work that they produce.
Thanks, Janet.
So if you could write to me, Janet, at ipa.co.uk, I will collate your questions in order to brief the guys on things that you would like to know more about. A deal?
Come here.
We'll ask.
Thanks very much.
Apologies to the other speakers for delaying you. Big apologies.